Hello, friends. We are very interested to know which cities you are listening to us from, so quickly like and write in the comments where you are from. Also, share what shocking stories happened in your city or maybe even with you personally. Subscribe because the next story could be about your city or even your personal drama. Now let's dive into a new exciting story. Dust rose from the gravel road as Zach Miller's old pickup pulled up at a wooden sign, Echo Canyon Campground. The sun was already setting towards the horizon, turning the Arizona rocks crimson. Zach, wearing a tattered plaid shirt and a faded baseball cap, climbed out of the cabin, slamming the door. His gaze slid over the familiar landscape. A canyon, carved by nature over millions of years, spread out before him, silent and majestic. He adjusted the knife belt on his belt and breathed in the dry air, saturated with the smell of pine trees and earth. Zach. A voice came from the main house. Candace, his wife, stood on the porch with her hands on her hips. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a messy bun and her Vegas baby t-shirt looked like she was nostalgic for her old life. Tourists are already on their way. Where have you been? I was checking the trail on the western slope, Zach answered, walking towards her. His boots squeaked on the gravel. There was a rockfall there. We had to clear it out. Alone again, Candace narrowed her eyes, crossing her arms. I asked you to take one of the assistants. If you get knocked down, I won't drag your carcass back. Zach grinned, but a hint of fatigue flashed in his eyes. I can handle it, Candy. I always managed. She snorted, but her gaze softened. Zach brushed past her, brushing his shoulder slightly, and headed toward the front desk, a small wooden shed where maps, flashlights, and a booking log were kept. Candace followed, her flip-flops clapping against the porch boards. They're from Phoenix, she said, referring to tourists. A family with 2 children and a couple of other hippies. We booked 3 tents and a house. They said they wanted a real canyon experience. Real experience? Zach opened the magazine, running his finger over the list of names. That is until they meet a scorpion in a shoe. Candace rolled her eyes, but the corners of her lips twitched into a smile. Don't start. You scare them all with your stories about snakes and coyotes. Last time that guy from Chicago almost left at night because you talked about the canyon spirit. I'm just being honest, Zach shrugged, taking out a bunch of keys. If you are not ready for nature, let them sit in the city. Candace leaned against the doorframe, watching him lay out cards and lanterns for the guests. Sometimes it seems to me that you love this canyon more than me, she said quietly, almost jokingly, but a note of bitterness slipped into her voice. Zach froze for a second, but didn't turn around. He was used to such attacks from her. Candace was always like a spark, ready to flare up. When they met in Vegas 6 years ago, she was a waitress at the bar where he was drinking beer after yet another business trip. Her laughter, her audacity, her ability to hold the audience in her fist, all of this hooked him. He pulled her out of that swamp, from the guy who raised his hand to her, and took her here to Arizona. They got married 3 months later, bought this land, and started building a campground. But in the last couple of years, something has changed. Candace increasingly looked at the phone rather than at the stars. The canyon doesn't require likes from me, he finally answered, turning to her. And he doesn't grumble when I come back late. She wanted to say something, but in the distance she heard the noise of a motor. Zach looked out the window to see 2 cars, a minivan, and a beat-up SUV raising clouds of dust as they approached the campsite. It's time, he said, putting on his work smile. Let's go meet you. The family from Phoenix turned out to be loud but friendly. The father, Mark, a strong man of about 40, immediately shook Zach's hand, as if testing his strength. The mother, Linda, chatted incessantly while their children, a boy of about 10 and a teenage girl, looked at the canyon with delight. The hippies, as Candace called them, were a couple from Colorado, a guy with dreadlocks named Jasper and his girlfriend Moon, who wore a necklace made of stones and smelled of patchouli. This place, it's alive, Jasper said, arms outstretched as Zach led them towards the tents. Do you feel it? Earth energy, brother. I feel it, Zach nodded, holding back a grin. especially when the wind blows sand in your face. Candace took care of the family, helping Linda carry bags into the house. Zach heard her laughing at some joke Mark made, and her voice sounded the same as before, light, ringing. He involuntarily looked in her direction, but immediately looked away. Mr. Miller, the teenage girl, Emma, called, fiddling with the strap of her backpack. Is it true that there are cougars here? True, Zach replied, squatting down to be at the same level as her. But they are smart. If you don't go near them, they won't touch you. The main thing is not to run at night and not to leave food in the tent. Emma nodded, but her eyes widened. Have you seen them? A couple of times, he said, straightening up. They are like shadows. You will see, and it will no longer be there. Cool, she breathed, and her brother immediately ran up, demanding to tell her more. Zach led the group to their seats, explaining the rules, where the fire pit was, how to use the dry closets, where not to go without a flashlight. He spoke calmly, with his usual confidence, but his thoughts kept returning to Candace. Her words about the canyon were still ringing in my head. Maybe she's right. Maybe he really hid here, in this wilderness, instead of living. When the tourists had gone to their places, Zach returned to the main lodge. Candace was sitting on the porch with her phone, scrolling through Instagram. Her face was illuminated by the screen, and she did not notice how he approached. All? He asked, leaning on the railing. Yeah, she answered, without looking up from the phone. Linda is already asking where she can take a photo for stories. She said that the canyon is Instagrammable. Instagram, Zach repeated with a slight mockery. I thought he was just handsome. Candace looked up, and for a second he thought she wanted to say something important. But instead, she just shrugged. People love to share, Zach. This is fine. Maybe we should. Make a page for camping. Shoot sunsets, trails, you with an axe. Subscribers would love it. I don't need subscribers, he snapped, but tried to soften his tone. We already have enough guests. Why all this fuss? Bustle. Candace put the phone away and stood up, her voice becoming sharper. It's not a fuss, Zach. This is business. We could have earned twice as much if you hadn't resisted. Do you have any idea how many people would know about us? And then the crowds would arrive with drones and speakers. He shook his head. This is not our way, Candy. We built this place for those who want silence, not for bloggers. Oh, of course, silence, she snorted, crossing her arms. You and your precious silence. What about me? Am I supposed to sit in this hole all my life and pretend that I like it? Zach clenched his jaw. He knew she missed Vegas, the parties, the neon signs, the people looking at her with admiration. But every time she started this conversation, he felt like a wall was growing between them. If you feel so bad, he said quietly, why are you still here? Candace froze. Her eyes sparkled, but she quickly turned away as if she didn't want him to see. I didn't say I felt bad, she muttered. Just, forget it. She went into the house, slamming the door. Zach remained on the porch, looking out over the canyon. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, and the echo echoed along the rocks. He ran his hand over his face, trying to push away the fatigue. Maybe she's right. Maybe he really does keep her in a cage. But this land, this campsite, was all he had. Everything he built for them. He took a pack of cigarettes out of his pocket, an old habit he had never gotten rid of, and lit it, looking at the stars. Smoke rose into the sky, and his thoughts swirled around one question. How much longer could they pretend that everything was fine? The next morning, Zach woke up before dawn. Candace was still asleep, curled up under the covers on their bed. He quietly got dressed, took a thermos of coffee, and went out to the fire pit. The tourists had not yet woken up, and the campsite was shrouded in silence, the very silence that he valued so much. He sat on a log, watching the first rays of the sun touch the rocks. Mr. Miller? A voice rang out. It was Linda, wrapped in a blanket. I didn't think that anyone would get up before me. Just Zach, he smiled, taking a sip of coffee. Do you want it? She nodded, and he poured her a mug. They sat in silence, looking out over the canyon until Linda spoke. This place, it's special, she said. Mark and I wanted to bring the children to a place where there is no noise, where you can just be. Zach nodded, feeling the warmth of her words. That's why we built it, he said, so that people can hear themselves. Linda smiled, but her gaze became more serious. And you and Candace, have you been together for a long time? 6 years, he answered, and his voice trembled. Sometimes it seems like a lifetime. She's bright, Linda remarked. Like a star. It's probably not easy for her here. Zach looked at her, but didn't answer. He was not used to talking about personal things with strangers, but her words touched something inside. He finished his coffee and stood up. I'll go check the trails, he said. If anything, Candace is there. He left without looking back, but Linda's words still echoed in his head. Bright, like a star. Maybe he was really trying to hold on to something that couldn't belong to him. By noon, the hikers had scattered along the trails, and Zach returned to the cabin. Candace was in the kitchen preparing sandwiches for the guests. She looked at him, but didn't say anything. He was also silent. They moved side by side, like two people who knew each other too well and were too tired of pretending. There's a fire tonight, he said finally. I'll take care of the wood. Okay, she answered without looking up. Zach walked out, feeling something inside him shrink. He didn't know how to fix what was broken between them. The morning at the campground began with the usual rhythm. Zach went off to check the trails. Tourists from Phoenix were noisily getting ready for a walk, and Candace was sitting on the porch of the main cabin, staring at her phone. The screen glowed, reflecting her face as she scrolled through her Instagram feed. Glamour photos from Los Angeles, parties in Vegas, bloggers with perfect bodies and filters. All this was so far from the dusty canyon, but so close to her heart. She sighed, leaning back in her chair, and glanced at the empty road leading to the campsite. Silence. Only the wind rustled in the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a crow croaked. Candace stretched, her t-shirt riding up to reveal a strip of tan skin. She still looked like a Vegas girl, flamboyant, with long eyelashes and an easy walk that made men turn heads. But here, in the wilderness, there were no men, no spotlights, no cocktails with umbrellas. Only Zach, his canyon, and the endless tourists to whom she handed out maps and smiles. She opened the app again, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Maybe post a story, sunset over the canyon, or yourself against the backdrop of rocks, or... She shook her head. Zach still won't understand. He doesn't care about likes. The door of the house creaked, and Linda, a tourist from Phoenix, came out onto the porch with a mug of coffee in her hands. Her hair was pulled back into a ponytail, and her eyes showed the weariness of a mother trying to keep everything under control. "Good morning, Candace," she said, smiling. "Already on your feet?" "Yeah," Candace replied, putting the phone away. "Although you won't get much sleep here. Birds have been screaming since 5 in the morning." Linda laughed, sitting down next to her. "I like it. You won't hear this in the city. There are only cars and the neighbor's lawnmower." Candace nodded, but her smile was forced. City. She almost forgot what it was like to wake up to the roar of the streets, drink coffee in a crowded cafe, catch the glances of passers-by. Her fingers involuntarily squeezed the phone. "Do you miss the city?" Linda asked, taking a sip of her coffee. "Well, I mean, this place is amazing, but it's so quiet." Candace looked at her, as if deciding whether to be honest. Linda seemed kind, but Candace had long ago learned to keep her thoughts to herself, especially here, where Zach could hear any careless word. "Sometimes," she finally admitted, shrugging, "I'm from Vegas. Everything there is alive. And here there are only stones and Zach with his hikes." Linda nodded, her gaze softening. "Understand. I myself sometimes miss the noise. But Zach, he loves this place, and probably you too." Candace snorted, but then fell silent, afraid that she had said too much. Love? She wasn't sure anymore. Zach was like this canyon, solid, silent, impenetrable. He once saved her, pulled her out of that hole where her ex was yelling and throwing bottles. But now she felt locked in a different cage. Without neon, without music, without life. He likes silence, she said, looking at the road. And I don't know how to love her. Linda wanted to answer something, but then Emma, her daughter, ran out of the house with a backpack on her shoulder. Mom, Dad says it's time to go, she shouted. Candace, are you with us? Not today, honey, Candace replied, forcing herself to smile. I am in charge of the camp. Emma ran away, and Linda finished her coffee and stood up. I'll go get ready. Thanks for the coffee. And, if you want to chat, I'm here. Candace nodded, but her thoughts were already elsewhere. She opened the phone again, but instead of going to the feed, she went to messages. Empty. Not a single new notification. She texted a friend in Vegas, Tess, a couple days ago, but she didn't respond. Probably too busy partying and working at the casino. Candace clenched her teeth. Why is everyone living, but she's stuck here? By midday, the sun was hot and Candace went into the cabin to take care of business. She checked reservations for the next week, but her thoughts kept returning to yesterday's conversation with Zach. If you feel so bad, why are you still here? His words cut like a knife. She threw her pen on the table and leaned back in her chair, looking at the ceiling. Why is she here? Because she loved him? Because she promised? Or because she was afraid to return to Vegas and realized that there was no place for her there either? The door opened and Zach walked in. His shirt was covered in dust and beads of sweat glistened on his forehead. He dropped his backpack on the floor and headed to the refrigerator, taking out a bottle of water. The path is clear, he said without looking at her. Tomorrow I will lead the group to the viewing room. Great, Candace replied, without looking up from her laptop. Her voice was as cold as the morning air. Zach took a sip of water, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and looked at her. Is something wrong? She looked up, and for a second she wanted to express everything. How she was suffocating here, how she missed people, noise, life. But instead, she just shrugged. Everything is as usual. He nodded, but his eyes lingered on her a little longer than necessary. Zach could always read her, even when she was silent. It scared her and angered her. Candy, he began, putting the bottle on the table. We didn't talk about the future. Maybe it's time. Future. She closed the laptop. Her voice became sharper. What's the future, Zach? Sit here and count tenths for the rest of your life. He frowned, but didn't back down. I thought this was our plan. Camping land, just the two of us. You yourself wanted to leave Vegas. I wanted to. She stood up, her cheeks turning red. Because it was bad there. But this does not mean that I dreamed of becoming a forester. I thought we would live, not hide. Zach clenched his jaw. He hated it when she raised her voice, but he hated it even more when she was right. He really hid here from the war, from the past, from everything that could break him. But he thought she wanted the same thing. What are you suggesting? He asked quietly. Return to the city? Sell everything? Candace froze. She didn't know what she wanted. Vegas was toxic, but the canyon was empty. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table. I don't know, she admitted, and her voice trembled. But I can't do this anymore, Zach. I'm suffocating. He looked at her, and pain flashed in his eyes. But he didn't come up and hug her like he did before. Instead, he simply nodded. Fine. Think about what you want. I won't hold you. He took the backpack and left, leaving her alone. The door slammed and Candace felt something inside her clench. She opened her laptop, but instead of booking, she went to Instagram. The feed came to life again. Bloggers, parties, lights. She scrolled through until she came across a video. A guy with a drone was filming the sunset over the ocean. His smile, his energy. Something about him reminded her of who she used to be. She clicked on the profile. Troy Brooks, fitness blogger from California, 200,000 subscribers. She clicked subscribe without thinking. In the evening, the tourists returned from their walk and the campsite was filled with voices. Zach lit a fire and Candace served hot chocolate. Emma, the girl from Phoenix, ran up to her, beaming. Candace, we saw a hawk. He was huge. Cool, honey, Candace smiled, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She looked at Zach, who was explaining to Mark how to properly stack firewood. His movements were confident and calm. He was in his element. And she felt like a stranger. When everyone had gone to their tents, Candace remained by the fire. Zach walked over, holding 2 mugs of tea. "Here," he said, holding one out. "Cold." She took the mug but didn't look at him. "Zach," she began, looking into the fire, "do you really think that I can be happy here?" He sat down next to her, his elbow lightly touching hers. The silence lasted for a long time until he finally spoke. "I thought we were building something together. But if you don't need it, tell me. I don't want you to suffer." Candace clutched the mug, her eyes sparkling. "I don't know what I want," she whispered, "but I don't want to lose you." He nodded but didn't answer. They sat by the fire until the flames turned to coals. There was silence between them, but not the kind that calms. A dusty wind was blowing sand along the road to the campground when a black SUV with California license plates pulled up at the Echo Canyon sign. The sun was at its zenith, and the canyon glowed golden, reflecting the light from the red rocks. Candace, who was sitting at the front desk with her phone in her hands, looked up. Her mascara-rimmed eyes narrowed as she saw a guy get out of the car, tall, tanned, with perfectly coiffed hair and a smile that could sell toothpaste. He was dressed in a tight white t-shirt, shorts, and sneakers, looking like he stepped off the cover of a fitness magazine. Behind him, a case with a drone was sticking out of the trunk, and headphones were hanging around his neck. "Well, hello, civilization," Candace muttered, putting away the phone. She straightened her hair, straightened her shoulders, and walked out of the barn, feeling her heartbeat a little faster. Zach was somewhere on the trails with the hikers, which meant she was in charge, and also that no one will see her play a little bit of old Candace from Vegas. The guy noticed her and headed towards the counter, carrying a sports bag. His walk was light and confident, like that of a man who knows that all eyes are on him. Candace greeted him with a smile, the same one that once made customers at the bar leave generous tips. "Welcome to Echo Canyon," she said, tilting her head slightly. "I'm Candace. You must be our new guest." "Troy Brooks," he replied, holding out his hand. His voice was deep and slightly hoarse, like a podcast host. "And you seem to be the queen of this place." Candace laughed, shaking his hand. His hand was warm, and he held it a little longer than necessary. She felt a slight current run down her spine. "Queen?" she asked, arching an eyebrow, more like a tent overseer. "But I like your approach." Troy grinned, looking her up and down. It was not a rude look, rather an appraising one, like that of a person who was used to reading people in a second. Candace knew that look. In Vegas, there were guys like this in every casino, but this one was different. There was something magnetic about him. "Okay, Troy Brooks," she said, opening the booking log. "1 tent, 3 nights. Are you planning a hike or just a vacation?" "A little of this, a little of that," he replied, leaning on the counter. His elbows almost touched her arms. "I shoot content. Canyons, sunsets, all this beauty. My followers love it when I show something wild." "Subscribers?" Candace looked up, her eyes lit up. "Are you a blogger?" "Fitness, travel, lifestyle," he nodded, taking out his phone. "At Troy Brooks if you want to take a look. But I warn you, you might get stuck." She grinned, but her fingers were already itching to take the phone and check. Instead, she crossed her arms, leaning forward slightly. "Sounds cool. But you know, this is not Los Angeles. The internet catches every now and then, and Scorpios don't subscribe." Troy laughed, loudly and contagiously, and Candace felt her cheeks warm. She hadn't flirted like this in years. With Zach, everything was different, warm, reliable, but without that spark, without that heat that was now running through her veins. "I can handle it," Troy said with a wink. "Are you, Candace, filming anything? You have a face for the camera." She rolled her eyes, but her smile widened. "Oh yes, I am the star of the local canyon. I filmed Zach chopping wood. Hit of the season." "Zach?" Troy narrowed his eyes, but his tone remained light. "Is this your boss?" "Husband," she answered, and the word sounded heavier than she expected. She quickly added, "He's the head of the trails here. Now, with tourists, I will be back in the evening." Got it, Troy nodded, but there was a spark in his eyes. "So you hold down the fort. Maybe you can show me the place. I love it when I am greeted in a big way." Candace felt her pulse speed up. It was just flirting, nothing serious. But damn, how she missed it. She took the keys to the tent and the map. "Come on, Instagram star," she said, walking around the counter. "Just don't film me without filters." They walked to the tent area, and Candace talked about camping, where the fire pit is, how to avoid getting lost on the trails, what to do if you see a coyote. Troy listened, but his gaze kept flicking to her and not to the canyon. He joked and told stories about his trips about surfing in Malibu, partying in Miami, filming from a drone in Yosemite. Candace hung on every word, her laughter ringing across the clearing. She felt alive, as if someone had turned on a light after a long period of darkness. "Seriously, Candace," Troy said as they stopped at his tent. "You need to be in the frame. With your energy, you could gain 1 million subscribers in a month." "Okay," she waved it off, but her cheeks were burning. "I'm not talking about that. I, I just live here." "Are you just living?" He stepped closer, his voice deeper. "You don't look like the kind of girl who is content with easy. You have fire inside you." Candace froze. His words touched something deep inside, something that she had tried to drown out through years of silence and dust. She wanted to answer, but then the sound of footsteps came from afar. The hikers were returning from the trail, and Zach walked ahead, his backpack swinging on his shoulder. Candace stepped back, her smile strained. "I have to go," she said quickly. "Make yourself comfortable. If anything, I'm at the counter." Troy nodded, but his gaze lingered on her. "See you, Queen of the Canyon," he said quietly, and there was promise in his voice. By evening, the campsite came to life. Tourists from Phoenix were preparing dinner, hippies from Colorado were playing guitar, and Zach was building a fire. Candace was passing around mugs of hot chocolate, but her mind was elsewhere. Every now and then she found herself searching for Troy with her eyes. He sat outside his tent, setting up his drone, the light from his phone screen reflecting in his eyes. She felt herself drawn to him like a magnet. "Candace," called Linda, a tourist sitting by the fire. "Come to us, tell us something." Candace forced herself to smile and sat down next to her family. Emma, a teenage girl, moved immediately, beaming. "Did you see that guy with the drone?" she asked in a whisper. "He's like from a movie." "Yes, I noticed," Candace replied, trying to sound indifferent. "Just another guest." "Not easy," Emma lowered her voice. "I heard him talking on the phone. He's filming for some big channel. Maybe we'll be in his video." Candace grinned, but her heart skipped a beat. Video, cameras, attention. Everything she needed so much. She looked at Zach, who was explaining to Mark how to properly toss wood. His face was calm and concentrated. He was in his element. And she felt like she was on the edge of a cliff. Troy walked up to the fire, holding a bottle of water. His t-shirt clung slightly to his body, emphasizing his muscles. He smiled at the group, but his eyes fell on Candace. "Cool place," he said, sitting down next to her. "I never thought I would find such a canyon, and such people." Candace felt her cheeks heat up. She knew Zach was looking at them, but she couldn't stop. "Well, we're trying," she answered, leaning slightly towards him. "So you shoot masterpieces." "I'm trying," Troy winked. "Maybe you can help. I need someone who knows the canyon like the back of his hand." "I'll think about it," she said, and her voice was slightly hoarse. She felt herself drawn towards him, as if towards an abyss, and she liked it. Zach coughed and Candace winced. He stood by the fire, his eyes were dark, impenetrable. "Candy," he said calmly, "can you help with firewood?" She nodded, standing up. Her legs were shaking, but she forced herself to walk. Troy looked after her, and she felt his gaze on her back, like a burn. Later, when the tourists had left, Candace and Zach remained by the fire. The flames crackled, casting shadows on their faces. She waited for him to say something, but he remained silent, looking into the fire. "The new guest seems fine," she finally said, trying to sound casual. "He says he's filming a video." "Yeah," Zach replied without looking up. The drone saw him. Noisy. Candace snorted, but her heart was pounding. "Don't start. He's just doing his job." "Whatever you say," Zach shrugged. But his voice was colder than usual. They sat in silence, and Candace felt a wall growing between them. She wants to tell him about Tro, about how he made her laugh, how he awakened something long forgotten in her. But instead, she clutched her mug and looked up at the sky. Somewhere out there, beyond the stars, there was another life. And for the first time in a long time, she felt that she could reach her. The canyon was smoking hot when Zach returned from the western trail. His backpack weighed down his shoulders, and his boots were covered in red dust. The sun was setting towards the horizon, and shadows from the rocks lay in long stripes on the ground. He stopped at the stream to fill his canteen and closed his eyes for a second, inhaling the smell of pine trees and hot stone. The silence of the canyon always calmed him, but today something was different. Something was gnawing at him from the inside, like a splinter that he could not pull out. Candace. Her distant look, her smiles, which now belonged not to him, but to the phone screen. He clutched the flask and walked on. The campsite greeted him with the usual buzz. Tourists from Phoenix were preparing a barbecue. Hippies from Colorado were singing with a guitar, and Troy, that damn blogger with a drone, was fiddling around his tent, setting up his camera. Zach glanced at him briefly, but didn't say anything. He wasn't the type to make a scene, but something about this guy, his easy smile, his confidence made his jaw clench. Candace was behind the front desk, flipping through the reservation's log. Her hair was down and her lips were shiny with gloss. She rarely wore makeup so brightly while camping. Zach noticed this yesterday when she stopped in town, supposedly for groceries. 3 o'clock. Too long for a store 10 miles away. "Everything is fine?" he asked, throwing his backpack on the floor of the barn. Candace looked up, and her smile was too fast, too artificial. "Yeah, everything's great," she replied, closing the magazine. "Just checking the reservations. Another group is coming tomorrow." "You came back late yesterday," he said, trying to keep his voice even. "Did something happen?" She shrugged without looking at him. "Nothing. There was a traffic jam, and there's a line at the store." Zach nodded, but his eyes lingered on her. Cork. In a town with 2 traffic lights. He didn't argue, but the pain in his chest grew deeper. He took the map and went out to check the trails for tomorrow's group. Candace looked after him, her fingers clenching the handle. She knew he noticed, but instead of feeling guilty, she felt angry. Why is he always like this? Why can't he just live like normal people? By evening, Zach was sitting around the campfire with the tourists, telling the story of an old Indian footprint that had been found in the canyon. His voice was calm, but his thoughts were swirling around Candace. She went to the town again for coffee, as she said. He didn't stop her, but her absence cut like a knife. When she returned, it was already dark. Her pickup truck stopped at the house, and she got out, holding a package. Zach noticed her look at her phone before entering. "Candy," he called as she passed the fire. "Come to us." She stopped, her eyes flashing in the firelight. "I'm tired, Zach," she said, her voice sharper than usual. "I'll go to bed." He nodded, but his eyes followed her until she disappeared into the house. The tourists continued to talk, but Zach was no longer listening. He took out a cigarette and lit it, looking into the fire. Something was wrong. He felt it on his skin, like before a storm. "Mr. Miller?" A voice rang out. It was Jasper, the dreadlocked hippie sitting across from him. His face was more serious than usual. "Can I have a few words with you?" Zach frowned but nodded. They walked away from the fire and Jasper lowered his voice. "I don't want to mind my own business," he began, fiddling with a beaded necklace. "But here's the thing. Moon saw something in the town, and, well, she made a video." Zach felt his heart clench. "What video?" he asked, his voice colder than he expected. Jasper hesitated, took out his phone, and opened the gallery. He handed it to Zach, who took it without looking up from the screen. The video was short, only about 30 seconds. The camera was shaking, but the image was clear. A motel parking lot in a small town, a pool of blue water, and two people at the edge. Candace, her blonde hair and red t-shirt, were unmistakable, and Troy. They stood close, too close, and then he leaned down and their lips met. A short kiss, but it was like a blow to the chest. Candace pulled away, looked around as if checking for witnesses, and they walked around the corner. Zach watched the video twice, his fingers gripping the phone until his knuckles turned white. Jasper coughed. "We didn't want to interfere," he said, "but Moon says you should know." Zach handed the phone back, his face as still as stone. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't tell anyone." Jasper nodded and went to the fire. Zach remained standing, looking into the darkness. His heart was pounding, but he did not feel anger, only emptiness, cold and heavy. He took out a cigarette, but didn't light it. I just stood there, listening to the wind whisper in the canyon. The house was quiet when Zach entered. Candace sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She looked up and her smile froze when she saw his face. "Did something happen?" she asked, putting the phone away. He looked at her, and for the first time in years he wanted to scream. But instead he sat down opposite her, his hands on his knees. "Where were you today?" he asked, and his voice was calm, but there was steel in it. Candace frowned, her fingers clenching the pillow. "I said, for coffee." "What kind of interrogation? At the motel?" He looked into her eyes, and she shuddered. "What?" Her voice became higher. "Are you serious? I stopped at a cafe next to the motel. They have a good latte." "Zach, what the hell is this?" He was silent, and this silence was worse than any words. Candace stood up, her cheeks flushed. "You don't trust me?" she said. "Is it because I was late? Or because I don't sit here like you and pray to this damn canyon?" "I saw the video, Candy," he said finally, and his words dropped like stones. "You and your blogger." She froze, her eyes widening. For a second, it seemed to him that she was going to cry, but instead she laughed sharply, nervously. "Video? Are you spying on me?" "God, Zach, this is funny." "Yes, I was there. We chatted." "This is not a crime." "We were chatting," he repeated, and his voice was empty. "You kissed him." Candace opened her mouth, but the words stuck. She turned away, her hands shaking. "It's not what you think," she said finally, but her voice was weak. It just happened. I didn't want to." Zach looked at her, and there was no anger in his eyes, only pain. He stood up, his movements slow, as if he was afraid that something inside would break. "I don't want to hear excuses," he said. "I just want the truth." "The truth?" She turned to him, her eyes shining with tears. "The truth is, I'm suffocating here, Zach. You live by your nature, and I die." Her words cut, but Zach didn't respond. He walked to the door, took his jacket, and left. Candace called after him. "Where are you going? Zach, come back." But he didn't turn around. He walked towards the canyon. His steps were heavy, as if he was carrying the whole world on his shoulders. The night was cold, the stars burned brightly, but they did not give answers. He sat on a stone near the cliff, looking into the darkness. The video played in his head like a worn-out tape. Kiss, her smile, her lies. The next morning, Zach woke up on the trail, covered with his jacket. The sun was just rising, and the canyon was shrouded in fog. He stood up, his body aching, but he felt nothing but tiredness. He returned to the campsite, but did not go to the cabin. Instead, he headed towards Troy's tent. He was already on his feet, filming the dawn from a drone. "Hey," Zach said, his voice hoarse, "we need to talk." Troy turned around. His smile was slight, but there was a hint of wariness in his eyes. "Of course, man," he replied. "What happened?" Zach looked at him, and for a second he wanted to punch him, but he restrained himself. "Get ready, it's time for you to leave," he said quietly. "This is not a request." Troy raised his eyebrows, but didn't back down. "Listen, I'm not looking for trouble," he said. "We were just chatting. If she told you something." "I saw the video," Zach interrupted. "Don't lie to me." Troy fell silent, his smile fading. He shrugged. "Okay, man, I understand. No offense. Zach nodded and left. He didn't know if he believed Troy, but it didn't matter anymore. The truth was that Candace chose, and it wasn't him. Zach walked along the path leading deeper into the canyon, his boots treading heavily on the rocky ground. The night was cold, the stars burned like shards of ice, and the wind carried the smell of pine trees and dust. His backpack contained only the essentials: a flask of water, a sleeping bag, a knife, and a pack of cigarettes that he had not opened for a year. But today he felt he would need it. His heart beat evenly, but inside everything was boiling not from anger, but from something deeper that he could not name. The video Jasper showed played in his head. Candace, her laugh, her lips on Troy's. This was not just a betrayal, it was the end. And Zach knew he couldn't stay at the campsite where every corner reminded her of her. He stopped at the main house when the moon was already hanging over the canyon. The lights in the windows were dim, and he knew Candace was probably still there, on her phone, scrolling through her feed as if nothing had happened. He entered quietly so as not to wake her if she was sleeping. The room smelled of her perfume sweet, with a hint of vanilla, and the smell cut him like a knife. Her t-shirt lay on the bed, carelessly thrown, and Zach froze for a second, looking at her. 6 years. For 6 years, they built this house, this campsite, this life, and everything collapsed in one kiss. He went to the chest of drawers where he kept his things and took out a wedding ring. Simple, silver, with a small scratch from the day he accidentally caught it on a rock. He twirled it in his fingers, feeling its weight. When he put it on Candace's finger in the little chapel in Vegas, she laughed and cried at the same time. "I'm yours, Zach," she said then. "Forever." He clenched the ring in his fist, his lips trembling. Forever turned out to be too short. Zach placed the ring on Candace's pillow, carefully, as if it was the last thing he could do for her. He didn't leave a note. Words were unnecessary. She will understand. He took the backpack, took one last look at the room and left, closing the door so quietly that he didn't even hear the wind. The path led up to a cliff that Zach called the edge of the sky. He went there when he needed to think, when the memories of his time in the Marines, the screams, the explosions, the blood became too loud. Now he went there to drown out another pain. His flashlight cast a narrow beam on the rocks, but he knew this path by heart. Every turn, every ledge. The canyon was his home, his refuge, but even he could not hide him from what was happening inside. Zach stopped halfway to catch his breath. His breath came out as steam in the cold air. He took out a cigarette, lit it, and took a drag, feeling the bitter smoke filling his lungs. He hasn't smoked since Candace asked him to quit. "I want you to live long," she said then, kissing him on the cheek. "For me?" He grinned, looking up at the stars. For her. What an idiot he was. Memories came flooding back like a wave. Their first meeting was in Vegas, when she spilled beer on him at a bar and laughed, calling him Mr. Serious. Their first night, they talked until dawn, lying on the roof of her old pickup truck. Their wedding, Candace in a white dress that she bought for $20 at a thrift store, and him in a cheap suit that pinched his shoulders. He thought it was love, real. But now he saw that it was an illusion, like a mirage in the desert. "Damn candy," he muttered, exhaling smoke. "Why?" He threw away the cigarette butt and rubbed it with his shoe. The questions were pointless. She made a choice, and now he must make his own. By morning, Zach reached the cliff. The edge of the sky was a flat ledge surrounded by pine trees, overlooking a canyon that seemed endless in the dawn light. He threw off his backpack and sat on a rock, watching the sun rise above the horizon. His face was tired, his eyes were red from a sleepless night, but he did not feel the desire to sleep. He felt nothing. The emptiness was worse than the pain. It was like a canyon deep, silent, endless. He took out a knife and started carving something into the bark of a pine tree just to keep his hands busy. His fingers moved mechanically, but his thoughts circled around Candace. Her laugh when they first came here and decided to buy this land. Her tears when he returned from the hospital after being wounded in Iraq. Her voice when she screamed yesterday, "I'm dying here, Zach." He clenched his teeth and his knife froze. She was dying. And him. He lived for her, for their dreams. So what now? Somewhere below, a crow croaked, and its cry echoed throughout the canyon. Zach looked down at the abyss, and for a second it seemed to him that she was calling him. One step, and it's all over. No pain, no memories. But he shook his head. He was not a coward. He went through hell in the desert, through bullets and death. He will survive this too. "You won't break me, Candy," he said into the void, and his voice was hoarse but firm. "Nobody will break it." He stood up, his shadow falling on the stones. He knew he couldn't stay here forever. The campsite was waiting. The tourists were waiting. Life was waiting. But he will give himself this pause one night to bury the past. He made a fire using dry branches that he collected along the way. The flames crackled, casting shadows on his face. He sat looking into the fire, and memories continued to creep into his head like uninvited guests. Their first year of camping, they slept in a tent because the cabin wasn't ready yet. Candace laughed then. Their first serious argument was when she wanted to go to the city, and he said that he could not live among the noise. Her eyes, which once looked at him with love, but now with fatigue and anger. He took out a flask and took a sip of water, but the taste was bitter. He remembered how Candace had changed in recent months. Her phone became her world. She scrolled through Instagram while he mended fences. She talked about huskies while he built a fire. She wanted to be someone else, somewhere else. And Troy, that damn blogger with his drone and his smile, gave her what Zach couldn't. Attention, fire, life. "I tried," he said, looking into the flames. "I really tried." The fire responded with a crackling sound, and Zach felt something inside him breaking. Not tears he hadn't cried since he lost his friend in the war. This was something different. Hope. He rubbed his face with his hands, his beard pricking his palms. He doesn't know how to live on. But he knew that he would not return to her. Not after this. At dawn, Zach packed up camp. He put out the fire, buried the coals, and checked that there were no traces left. The canyon taught him to respect nature, and even now, when his world was falling apart, he followed these rules. He slung his backpack over his shoulder and looked out over the canyon. The sun was rising, painting the rocks gold. It was beautiful, so beautiful that for a second he forgot about the pain. The canyon was silent as Zach descended from the trail at dawn. His boots crunched on the gravel, his backpack weighed down his shoulders, and his face, covered in dust and stubble, seemed carved from stone. The night at the cliff gave him clarity, but not relief. The emptiness inside remained, cold and heavy, like the stones he stepped over. He didn't know what Candace would say, but he knew they were going their separate ways. Now all that remained was to finish what had started. The campsite was still asleep when he reached the main lodge. The tourists from Phoenix and the hippies from Colorado didn't show up. Zach dropped his backpack on the porch and went inside. Candace was sitting in the kitchen, holding a mug of coffee. Her eyes were red, her hair was disheveled, and on the table lay his ring silver with that same scratch. She looked up, and for a second her face lit up with hope. "Zach," she breathed, standing up. "Where have you been? I didn't sleep half the night, looking for you." He looked at her, and his heart sank, but not from love, from fatigue. Her voice, her tears, her despair, all this was familiar, but now it seemed distant, like an echo in a canyon. "I need to go to the city," he said. His voice was hoarse but firm. "I'll be back in the evening." To the city. Candace stepped towards him, her hands shaking. "Zach, wait. We need to talk. I know I screwed up. It was a mistake, I swear." He raised his hand to stop her. His eyes were cold, unreadable. "Not now, Candy," he said. "I need time." She opened her mouth, but the words stuck. Zach walked by, took the keys to the pickup truck, and walked out. Candace remained standing, clutching the ring in her fist, her tears dripping onto the floor. She wanted to scream, to run after him, but something in his gaze and that emptiness stopped her. This was not the same Zach who once pulled her out of hell. This was the man she broke. The town 20 miles from the campsite was small, with one main street lined with a cafe, a pharmacy, and a lawyer's office. Zach parked the pickup in front of an old building with a sign that said Johnson and Sons Legal Services. He hadn't been here since he and Candace signed the papers to buy the land. Then they laughed, holding hands, dreaming about the future. Now he walked alone, with a folder under his arm containing their marriage contract and the certificate of ownership of the campsite. The lawyer, the elderly Mr. Johnson, greeted him with a tired smile. His office smelled of old paper and coffee. "Zachary Miller," he said, adjusting his glasses. "I didn't expect to see you." "What led?" Zach sat up, his movements slow, as if he was afraid something inside would crack. "Divorce," he said simply, "and the division of property. I want everything to be clean." Johnson raised his eyebrows, but didn't ask any more questions. He knew Zach knew he wasn't the type to talk more than he needed to. "Okay," he nodded, taking out a notepad. "Tell me what you need." Zach explained that he wanted to leave Candace half of their savings, but he had to keep the campsite. This was his land, his blood, his life. He spoke calmly, but his fingers clutched the edge of the table. Johnson took notes, nodding occasionally. "This will take a couple of weeks," he said finally. "I will prepare the documents. Are you sure, Zach? Divorce is a serious step." Zach looked out the window at the dusty street where the boy was riding his bike. "I'm sure," he replied. "She made a choice. Now it's my turn." Johnson sighed but nodded. Zach signed the preliminary papers, shook the lawyer's hand, and left. The sun burned, but he did not feel the heat. He felt only emptiness. In the evening, Zach returned to the campsite. The pickup pulled up outside the cabin, and he sat in the cab for a few minutes, looking at the folder of documents in the passenger seat. That was the end. Not just marriage, but everything he knew. He walked out, his steps heavy, as if he was carrying the canyon on his shoulders. Candace was in the living room, sitting on the couch. She jumped up when he entered, her eyes full of tears. "Zach, thank God," she breathed. "I thought you wouldn't come back. Please listen to me." He looked at her, and his face was as motionless as a rock. He handed her the folder. His hand did not tremble. "We should have talked earlier. These are divorce papers," he said. "Sign when you're ready." Candace froze, her eyes widening. The folder fell to the floor, the pages scattered. "What?" she whispered. "Zach, no. You can't. I told you it was a mistake. I didn't want to." "That's enough, Candy," he interrupted, his voice quiet but sharp as a knife. "I saw you with him. I heard your excuses. This is the end. You've wanted this for a long time. But you should have filed for divorce first, and then received your bright emotions on the side." She stepped towards him, her hands reaching for his chest, but he retreated. "Zach, please," her voice broke. "I love you. I'm confused. Troy means nothing, I swear. Let's try again. I'll fix everything." He looked at her, and there was no anger in his eyes, only fatigue. Her tears, her words, her despair, it was all too late. "You wanted a different life," he said. "I can't give it to you. I won't go to live in the city. You feel bad here. We haven't been a family for a long time, and I don't want to pretend anymore." Candace fell to her knees, her sobs echoing in the room. Zach turned and walked out. He couldn't look at her, not because he hated, but because he still loved. And that was the worst of all. Zach headed into town to buy some camping supplies. He didn't want to stay near Candace, didn't want to hear her voice. He walked into the Marge Cafe, a small place with faded curtains and the smell of frying bacon. The waitress, an older woman with a kind smile, poured him coffee without asking. He was sitting by the window, looking out onto the street, when the door dinged and a woman entered. Tall, with dark hair pulled back into a ponytail, wearing jeans and a plaid shirt. Hope McCrae, local veterinarian. Zach knew her. She had come to the campsite a couple of times to pick up an injured hawk or coyote. Her husband died in an accident 3 years ago, and since then she has kept to herself, as has Zach. "Zach Miller," Hope said, approaching his table. Her voice was warm, but there was caution in her eyes. "I didn't expect you here. Everything is fine." He looked at her, and for a second he wanted to tell her everything. But instead he shrugged. Just coffee, he replied. And you? Same thing, she smiled, sitting down opposite him. And a little respite from work. Today I pulled a cat out of a well. Zach grinned, and it was the first sincere smile in days. You always save someone, he said. I'm trying, she answered, taking a sip of coffee. And you? Is the campground still afloat? For now, yes, he nodded. But everything changes. Hope looked at him, her gaze soft but penetrating. She didn't ask questions, and Zach was grateful for that. They talked about little things about the canyon, about tourists, about how her dog tore up the new sofa. It was simple, unobtrusive, and for the first time in a long time, Zach felt like he could breathe. As they said goodbye, Hope put her hand on his shoulder. If anything, Zach, she said quietly, I'm nearby. He nodded, not knowing what to answer. But her words remained with him like a warm trace in the cold night. Back at the campsite, Zach got down to business. He checked the tents, mended the fence, and talked to tourists. Candace didn't show, and he was glad for that. He didn't know how long he could control himself if he saw her again. But he knew one thing. He was now a loner, and maybe it's better this way. Candace drove her pickup truck down the highway from Arizona to California, her fingers gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. The radio was blaring a pop song, but she could barely hear the words. Her thoughts were somewhere between rage and hope. The folder with the divorce papers lay on the passenger seat, its edges crumpled, as if she had tried to rip it but couldn't bring herself to. Zach. His cold eyes, his words, "This is the end," cut deeper than she expected. She wanted to scream, to beg, but he left, leaving her alone with her guilt and emptiness. And now she was on her way to Troy, to his world of lights, cameras, and likes, where she hoped she could breathe again. Los Angeles met her with smog and endless traffic jams. She entered the city in the evening, when the neon signs lit up, like in Vegas, but with a different rhythm, faster, more predatory. Troy sent her the address of his downtown loft, and she found it after an hour of wandering the streets, where every second person looked like an Instagram model. The building was stylish, with large windows and graffiti on the walls, and the elevator smelled of expensive perfume. Candace straightened her hair while looking in the mirror and tried to smile. She was still beautiful, long blonde hair, bright eyes, a figure for which she was praised in Vegas. But inside she felt broken, like glass that was about to shatter. Troy answered the door wearing a tight black t-shirt and holding a glass of wine. His smile was the same as at the campsite, light, magnetic, but now there was something new, something appreciative. "Candace," he said, stepping back to let her pass. "Welcome to my world." She walked in, her suitcase hitting the floor. The loft was huge, high ceilings, brick walls, a leather sofa, and a table covered with cameras and laptops. There was a huge screen on the wall where his latest video was playing Troy on the beach with a drone to a track with millions of views. Candace felt her heart beat faster. This was what she dreamed about, right? "Cool," she breathed, looking around. "It's like in a movie." "This is La Baby," Troy laughed, pouring her some wine. "Everything here is like in a movie. Get used to it." She took the glass, her fingers trembling. They clinked glasses and Troy looked into her eyes. His gaze was warm, but there was something else in it, something that made her feel like prey. "Okay," he said, sitting down on the sofa and patting the seat next to him. "What's happened? Did you just lose your temper or—" Candace swallowed, her smile faltering. She didn't want to talk about Zach, about the ring, about the documents. But the words came out on their own. "Zach, he filed for divorce," she said quietly. Troy raised his eyebrows, but his face remained calm. "Tough," he said, taking a sip of wine. "But, maybe it's for the better. You weren't made for that wilderness. You're a star, Candace, and the stars shine in the cities." His words were like a bomb, and Candace felt her cheeks warm. She sat closer, her knee touching his. "Do you really think so?" she asked, her voice hoarse with hope. "I know," he said, leaning towards her. "I saw how you lit it up. You belong here with me." He kissed her, and Candace closed her eyes, giving in to the moment. His lips were hard, demanding, not like Zach's, but she wanted it, she wanted to forget, she wanted to feel alive. She hugged him, her fingers dug into his shoulders, but somewhere deep in her soul something pierced. She pulled away, her breathing heavy. Troy, she began, I don't know if I'm ready. He chuckled, leaning back on the couch. Relax, Candace, he said. We're in no hurry. But you are here, and this is already a step. She nodded, but her heart was pounding. She wanted to believe him, wanted to drown in this world. But something in his tone, in his gaze, made her feel not like a guest, but like a trophy. The first days in Leh were like a dream. Troy took her around the city. They drank cocktails in rooftop bars, filmed stories in Santa Monica, danced in clubs where the music hit her ears and the strobe lights blinded her eyes. Candace laughed, her phone full of notifications, likes, comments, subscribers. Troy featured her in his videos, calling her the Queen of the Canyon, and she felt like a star. People turned around as they passed, and she caught their eyes, just like she did in Vegas. This was the life she dreamed of, right? But cracks began to appear quickly. Troy was busy filming, meetings, calls. He left her in the loft for hours, and when he returned, his smile was not so warm. He talked about brands, contracts, and how you have to keep the level. Candace tried to fit in. She bought a dress she couldn't afford, learned to pose for his camera, but every time she offered something of her own, he brushed it off. Candace, that's not your style, he said one day when she suggested filming a video in the park. My subscribers want aesthetics, not, redneck. A hillbilly? She asked, her voice trembling. They stood in his loft, and the lights of La sparkled outside the window. I thought you liked that I'm from the canyon. I like it, he said, but his tone was harsh. But there's a different vibe here. You're either in the game or you're not. She fell silent, her cheeks burning. She nodded and went into the bathroom so he wouldn't see her tears. The scandal had been brewing for a week. Candace tried to be in the game, but every day she felt more and more alien. Troy became irritable, especially when she interfered with his filming. One evening, when they returned from another bar, he threw the camera on the table and turned to her. Candace, what's wrong with you? He asked, his voice cold. You walk around with a sour expression, as if I forced you to come here. Did you force it? She stood up from the sofa, her eyes sparkling. You said I was a star, Troy. You said I belong here, and now I'm like furniture. Furniture? He laughed, but the laugh was evil. Look, I gave you a chance. You wanted here it is. But if you can't keep up the pace, that's not my problem. Your problem. Candace stepped towards him, her voice trembling with rage. I gave up everything for you. My home, my marriage, and you don't even look at me if I'm not in the frame. Troy clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowed. Marriage, he said. You destroyed it yourself, Candace. Don't put this on me. And guess what? I didn't subscribe to your dramas. I need content, not tantrums. Her heart sank. She looked at him, at his handsome face, which now seemed alien, and felt like the world was collapsing. She wanted to hit him, but instead her voice became quiet, almost a whisper. You used me, she said, for your videos, for your image. I was just a prop. Troy shrugged, and it was worse than any slap. Call it what you want, he said. But if you're not in the business, you don't belong here. Pack your things. Candace froze, her breathing ragged. She expected him to soften, to say that he was joking. But he turned to the laptop and began flipping through files as if she was no longer there. She stood in the middle of the loft, her hands were shaking, and there was a lump in her throat. That was the end. Not only with Troy, but also with her dream. She packed her suitcase in half an hour. Troy didn't look at her, just said, Good luck, Candace, when she opened the door. The night in La was warm, but Candace was shivering as she stood on the sidewalk with her suitcase. The city lights that seemed so inviting now hurt my eyes. She opened her phone, her fingers hovering over Zach's name. She wanted to write, to say that she was mistaken, that she wanted to go home. But instead, she locked the screen and got into the pickup truck. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't return. Not now. She stopped at a cheap motel on the outskirts, where the neon sign flashed the letter M. The administrator, a sleepy guy with tattoos, gave her the key without asking questions. The room smelled damp and the sheets were hard, but Candace didn't care. She lay down on the bed, looking at the ceiling, and the tears finally flowed. She cried for Zach, for herself, for the illusion that shattered like glass. La was not her world, and perhaps he never was. The canyon woke up slowly, its red rocks caught the first rays of the sun, and the air was saturated with the smell of pine trees and earth. Zach stood at the campsite fence, hammer in his hand, beating out a rhythm as he hammered in a new post. Sweat ran down his temples, his shirt stuck to his back, but he didn't stop. Work was his salvation, the only thing that kept him from drowning in the emptiness that settled in his chest after Candace left. She left a week ago, taking her suitcase and leaving the signed divorce papers on the table. Zach didn't look after her. He just took a hammer and started fixing everything that was broken at the campsite fences, tents, the roof of the house. As if by repairing wood and metal, he could fix himself. Campers came and went, their voices and laughter filling the campsite, but Zach kept to himself. He smiled when necessary, answered questions, led groups along the trails, but his eyes were empty like a canyon at midnight. Even Linda, a tourist from Phoenix, noticed this when he helped her children start a fire. "Zach, are you okay?" she asked one day, her voice soft but insistent. "You look tired." "Just a lot of work," he answered without looking at her. "Camping doesn't wait." She nodded, but her gaze lingered on him. Zach knew people were whispering. Rumors about Candace and Tro, about her departure, spread faster than a fire in dry grass. But he didn't care. Let them talk. He wasn't going to explain, make excuses, or cry. He just worked. By midday, Zach had moved on to a new project, an animal enclosure. The idea came when he found a wounded hawk on the trail and took it to the town of Hope McCrae. She picked up the bird, her hands moving firmly but gently as she examined the wing. "He'll be fine," she said at the time, "but he needs a place to recover." Zach nodded, and a thought popped into his head, a campsite enclosure, a place where Hope could keep injured animals until they got stronger. It wasn't just for the birds, it was for him. Something that could give meaning to his days. He was digging post holes when Hope's old pickup truck pulled into the campground. She walked out, her dark hair pulled back into a messy bun, and she was holding a toolbox in her hands. Her jeans were covered in dust, and her t-shirt had a stain of machine oil. She looked like someone who wasn't afraid of work, and Zach couldn't help but respect that. "I heard you started a construction project," Hope said, approaching. Her voice was warm, with a hint of mockery. "Have you decided to become an architect for coyotes?" Zach wiped the sweat from his brow and grinned for the first time in a week. His smile was sincere. "Something like that," he answered, sticking the shovel into the ground. "I want to make an aviary. For your patients." Hope raised her eyebrows, her eyes sparkling. "Seriously?" She put the box on the ground and looked around the area. "That's cool, Zach. But are you sure you can do it alone? It's not a fence to fix." "I'm not alone," he said, nodding toward her box. "You didn't just come." She laughed, and her laughter was as light as the wind in a canyon. "Got it," she said. "Okay, show me what you have here." They worked all day, their movements were coordinated, as if they had been doing this for years. Zach dug and hammered posts, Hope sawed boards and stretched the mesh. They didn't say much, but their silence was comfortable, without the heaviness that hung in the air when Candace was around. Hope talked about animals, a hawk that started to fly, a fox that bit her finger, and Zach listened, feeling her voice soften his pain. "Are you always like this?" he asked when they stopped to drink water. The sun was burning, and he handed her a flask. "Which?" Hope wiped her brow, her eyes narrowed. "You save everyone," he said. "Birds, foxes, well, cats. Now here's me." She looked at him, and her smile became quieter. "Not everyone," she answered, "but I will try. And you? You don't look like someone who needs saving, Zach. You're just." A little lost. Her words touched something inside, and Zach looked away, looking out over the canyon. Lost. Maybe she's right. He lost not only Candace, but also himself, who he was before her, before the war, before everything. Maybe, he said finally, but I will find a way. Hope nodded, and there was something in her eyes that he couldn't read. Not pity, not curiosity, something deeper. She patted him on the shoulder. Then let's build, she said. This enclosure will not make itself. By evening, the enclosure began to take shape. The pillars stood straight, the mesh was stretched, and the wooden frame for the roof lay ready. Zach and Hope sat on a log, looking at their work. The campsite came to life. Tourists returned from the trails, the fire crackled, and somewhere in the distance, a hippie guitar sang. Not bad for the first day, Hope said, taking a sip of water. Are you sure you're not an architect? Nope, Zach replied, his voice softer than usual. Just a guy with a hammer. She grinned, but her gaze lingered on him. You are more than you seem, Zach Miller, she said quietly. Don't forget this. He looked at her, and for a second he wanted to say something real, about how he was drowning, how he was afraid that he would never get out. But instead, he simply nodded. Thank you, Hope, he said, for help, and for everything. She smiled, and her hand touched his elbow for a second. You're welcome, she replied, but I'll be back. This enclosure is my ticket to the Hawks. Zach laughed, and it was the first real laugh he'd had in a long time. Hope stood up, picked up the box, and headed to her truck. He looked after her, feeling something warm stirring in his chest. Not love, not hope, just trust. Light as the wind, but real. At night, Zach sat by the fire alone. The tourists dispersed and silence fell over the campsite. He looked into the fire, his fingers twisting a nail that was left over from a construction site. Candace was gone, but her shadow still hovered here in the house, in the tents, in every corner. He knew he had to let go, but it wasn't that easy. He built this campsite for them, for their dreams, and now he was building it for himself. He threw the nail into the fire and looked at the stars. The canyon was his home, his ruins, and maybe he can build something new from these ruins. Not for Candace, not for the past, but for myself. And perhaps for those who, like Hope, saw more in him than himself. Dust settled on the canyon trails as Zach returned to the campsite from another group of hikers. His boots crunched on the gravel and his backpack weighed down on his shoulders, but he barely noticed the weariness. Work became his rhythm, his breathing. The days melted into weeks, and he had almost gotten used to the silence that was left after Candace left. The campsite was thriving: new tents, a renovated cabin, an almost finished animal enclosure. But inside Zach, there was still emptiness, like scorched earth after a fire. He didn't talk about it, didn't show it, but she was there, and every evening, sitting by the fire, he felt her weight. The mailbox at the entrance to the campground was old, and Zach rarely looked in it. He checked bills and advertisements once a week, but today, while passing by, he noticed a white envelope sticking out of the slot. His name was written in familiar handwriting, uneven, with curls on the letters. Candace. His heart sank for a second, but he did not allow himself to waver. He pulled out the envelope, put it in his jacket pocket, and walked towards the house without looking back. It was quiet inside, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Zach dropped his backpack on the floor and sat down at the kitchen table, looking at the envelope. He didn't want to open it. I didn't want to hear her voice, even on paper. But something, curiosity, pain, or perhaps weakness, made him take the knife and cut the edge. Inside was one sheet of paper covered in her handwriting. He unfolded it, and the smell of her perfume, the same one with a hint of vanilla, hit his nostrils like a memory. Letter to Candace. Zach. I don't know where to start. Probably because I'm ashamed. I'm sitting in a motel on the outskirts of Leh, and all I can think about is you. How you stand by the fire, how you look at the canyon, how you remain silent when you are in pain. I ruined everything, Zach. I know, and I hate myself for it. Troy was a mistake. I thought he would give me the life I was missing. Lights, cameras, likes. I wanted this so much. But he left me like trash, and now I'm alone, trying to figure out how I got to this point. I don't blame you. You gave me everything: a home, love, a chance to start over. And I betrayed you. I'm not asking to come back. I know I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I'm sorry. Every second. I see your eyes when you leave the ring on the pillow, and it kills me. Sorry, Zach. Sorry for everything. Candace. Zach finished reading and put the letter aside. His face was motionless, like a rock, but something stirred inside: not anger, not pity, but something in between, like the shadow of an old pain. He reread the last line, "Sorry, Zach," and his lips trembled. Sorry, a word that doesn't change anything. He remembered her laughter in Vegas, her tears when he pulled her out of that hole, her voice when she screamed that she was suffocating. He gave her everything he could, but it wasn't enough. And now she wrote as if words could stitch up the wound. He stood up, took the letter, and walked out to the fire pit. The campsite was empty. The tourists had gone to their tents, and only the stars were shining overhead. Zach lit the fire, his movements mechanical, as if he had done this 1,000 times. The flame flared up, licking the dry branches, and he looked at the letter in his hand. Her handwriting, her words, her smell, all this was part of the past that he had to let go of. He brought the sheet to the fire, and the paper burst into flames, curling into black ash. He watched her disappear and felt something inside settle, like dust after the wind. "I'm sorry," he said into the void, not to her, but to himself. For believing, for loving, for not seeing the truth sooner. He threw the remains of the letter into the fire and sat on the log, watching the flames consume the last traces of her words. The canyon was silent, but its silence was alive, like breathing. Zach leaned back, his eyes raised to the sky. The stars burned brightly, endlessly, indifferently. He looked at them for a long time, as if he was looking for an answer that was not there. His fingers squeezed the edge of the log, and he felt the fatigue rolling in, but not the physical one, the one that lives in the bones, but the one that gnaws at the soul. Earlier that day, Zach had been working on the enclosure with Hope. She arrived in the morning. Her pickup truck was loaded with boards and animal feed. They spoke little, but their work was as coordinated as a dance. Hope joked about how her dog had ripped up the pillow again, and Zach smiled as he felt her presence soften the edges. When they finished putting up the roof of the enclosure, she looked at him, wiping the sweat from her brow. "Are you okay, Zach?" she asked, her voice soft but direct. "You look like the canyon fell on you." He shrugged as he drove in the last nail. "It's just the day," he replied. "Lots of things to do." Hope narrowed her eyes, but didn't press. She knew he wasn't the sharing type. Instead, she patted him on the shoulder. "If anything happens, I'm here," she said. "And my dog, too. True, he eats more than he helps." Zach grinned, and her words stayed with him like a warm trace. Hope left, and he continued to work, but her question was running through his head. Is he okay? He didn't know. But he knew that he had to move on, even if every step was like pieces. The night grew colder, and Zach added more wood to the fire. The ashes from Candace's letter mixed with the coals, and he felt a strange sense of relief. Not from her words, not from her guilt, but from the fact that he was able to let go of at least this small part of the past. He remembered how he and Candace sat around this same fire years ago, how she laughed, calling him Mr. Serious. Then he thought it was forever. Now he knows that forever does not exist. He took out a flask of water and took a sip, but the taste was as bitter as his thoughts. Candace was out there somewhere and lay in a motel in her pain. He didn't hate her. He didn't feel sorry for her. He just didn't feel anything. And that was what scared me the most. The canyon was shrouded in the gold of the sunset. Its rocks reflected the last rays of the sun, and the air became cooler, carrying the smell of pine trees and smoke from the fire. Zach stood at the enclosure that he and Hope were almost finished with. The mesh was taut, the roof was reinforced, and the wooden door he had carved himself stood on its hinges. It wasn't just an enclosure, it was his way of telling the canyon that he was still here, still fighting. He wiped his hands on his jeans, looking at his work, and felt something akin to satisfaction. Not joy, not relief, but something warm that made its way through the emptiness, like a sprout through a crack in a stone. Hope had arrived an hour ago, her pickup truck pulling to a stop at the campsite with its familiar creaking sound. She brought bird feeders and a couple of cans of paint to paint the frame of the aviary. Her hair was braided, and there was a new stain on her t-shirt this time from cat hair. She got out of the car, her eyes sparkling when she saw the enclosure. "Zach Miller," she said, placing her hands on her hips. "Is this almost ready? You'll leave me without a job." Zach chuckled, his smile lighter than he expected. "Don't be afraid," he answered, nodding towards the paint cans. "There will always be something for you to do." She laughed, and her laughter was like the wind free, alive. They worked for another hour, painting the frame and installing the feeders. Hope joked about how her dog tried to steal a chicken from the neighbor's yard, and Zach listened, feeling her voice soften the edges of his. When the sun set, they finished, and the enclosure stood ready, like a little corner of life in the middle of the canyon. "Not bad," Hope said, stepping back to admire it. "The first hawk will be delighted." "If he doesn't start pecking at the net," Zach answered, wiping the paint from his hands. "Will you stay for dinner?" The words came out on their own, and he froze for a second, as if he couldn't believe he'd said it. Hope looked at him, her eyebrows raised, but she smiled. "Only if you have something other than beans from a can," she said with a wink. "You offend me," he answered, and his voice was softer than usual. "I have steaks, and even potatoes." "Then I'm in," Hope said, her eyes sparkling in the sunset light. The fire crackled, casting shadows on their faces as Zach grilled steaks on the grill. Hope sat on a log, holding a mug of coffee, her legs extended towards the fire. The campsite was quiet. The campers had retreated to their tents, and only the distant howl of a coyote broke the silence. Zach turned the meat, his movements were confident, but inside he felt a slight nervousness. He was not used to such evenings, to company, to conversations, to someone who expects nothing from him except himself. "Well, admit it," Hope said, taking a sip of her coffee. "Where did you learn to cook like this? This is not camp food, this is a straight restaurant." Zach grinned as he looked at the fire. "The army," he answered. "When you sit in the desert with stew and dream of normal food, you learn to get out." "Seriously." Hope leaned closer, her eyes curious but not intrusive. "Tell. You were in Iraq, right?" He nodded, his gaze becoming more serious. He rarely talked about the service. Too many shadows, too much pain. But with Hope it was different. She didn't press and didn't expect drama. She just listened. "2 dates," he said, transferring the steaks to plates. "Desert, patrols, heat, and the guys who become family. Some didn't return." Hope was silent, her face soft in the firelight. She didn't say, "I'm sorry," or anything trivial. Instead, she simply nodded. "And you're back," she said quietly, "and built this place. That's cool, Zach." He looked at her, and his throat tightened. He was not used to such words, to someone seeing him not as a soldier, not as Candace's husband, but as a person. He handed her a plate of food, their fingers touched for a second, and he felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "Eat before it gets cold," he said, hiding his awkwardness behind a rude tone. Hope smiled and picked up her fork. "Boss, yes," she answered with a wink. They ate, sitting by the fire, and the conversation flowed easily, like a stream. Hope talked about her clinic and how she trained to be a veterinarian so she could save those who can't speak. She mentioned her husband, but only in passing. The accident 3 years ago, the emptiness she had learned to live with. Zach listened, feeling her words resonate. She didn't pretend, she didn't play. She was real, and it was like a breath of air after a long dive. "And you, Zach?" she asked, putting the plate down. "What keeps you here? Except for the canyon, of course." He looked into the fire, his fingers twirling his coffee mug. The question was simple, but the answer is no. What was holding him back? Camping? Habit? Or something else he was afraid to name? "I don't know," he finally admitted. "This is probably the place. Here I can be myself." Hope nodded, her eyes were warm, but there was something deeper in them, understanding. That's a lot, she said. Being yourself is already a victory. Zach looked at her, and for the first time in a long time he smiled, not out of politeness, not out of habit, but sincerely. His face softened, the wrinkles around his eyes smoothed out, and he felt something inside him letting go. Not everything, not all at once, but enough to take a deep breath. "You're strange, Hope McCrae," he said, and his voice was light, almost playful. "You save birds, dogs, and now you sit here and make me smile." She laughed, throwing her head back, and her laughter was like music. "This is my super plan," she said with a wink. "First the hawks, then you. Soon you'll be singing by the fire." "Dream," he answered, but his smile grew wider. They sat for a long time, talking about little things, about the stars, about paths, about how her dog is afraid of thunderstorms. Zach felt the emptiness in his chest become smaller, as if hope, without knowing it, filled it with her warmth. He didn't think about Candace, about her letter, about the pain. For the first time in months he was here, at this moment, and that was enough. When Hope prepared to leave, night had already enveloped the canyon. She stood up, dusting off her jeans, and looked at Zach. "Thanks for dinner," she said, "and for the company. It was good." "Thank you," he replied, and his voice was sincere. "Come again. The aviary cannot cope without you." She smiled, her hand touching his shoulder for a second. "We agreed," she said. "Good night, Zach." On watching her pickup truck disappear into the darkness, Juno looked at Zach with curiosity. "This place, it's honest, doesn't lie, doesn't betray. Here I can be myself." Zach looked at her, and for the first time in a long time he smiled, not out of politeness, not out of habit, but sincerely. His face softened, the wrinkles around his eyes smoothed out, and he felt something inside him letting go. Not everything, not all at once, but enough to take a deep breath. The canyon was shrouded in morning mist, its rocks looking like ghosts in the soft light. Zach stood by the fire pit, checking the wood supply, his breath mixing with the cold air. The campsite lived its own life. Tourists from the new group were preparing breakfast, children were running between the tents, and laughter was heard somewhere in the distance. Zach was used to this rhythm, but today he felt different, lighter, as if the canyon was whispering to him that everything would be okay. It had been almost a year since Candace had left, and although her shadow still lingered in his thoughts, she was no longer an anchor. He built a new life, step by step, and the campsite became a reflection of him, a place where ruins turned into home. Hope arrived around noon. Her pickup truck pulled up to the enclosure that was now home to two hawks and an injured fox. She walked out carrying a crate of food, her hair pulled back into a loose ponytail and a smile on her face. Zach noticed how her presence became part of the campsite, not intrusive, but necessary, like sunshine after rain. "Zach Miller," she said, approaching. "Are you without coffee again? How do you even survive?" He chuckled, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Hawks don't complain," he answered, nodding toward the enclosure. "Are you with the food again? Soon there will be a zoo here." "Dream," Hope laughed, setting the box down. "But seriously, look at this place. You turned it into, I don't know, a sanctuary." Zach shrugged, but her words touched something inside. Sanctuary. He had never thought about camping like that. For him, it was a job, a way to survive, to keep himself in check. But Hope saw more, and her gaze made him look at everything differently. They walked to the aviary, where Hope began feeding the hawks. Zach watched her work, confident but gentle, talking to the birds as if they were friends. He found himself smiling, and it was so natural that he didn't even notice. "What?" Hope asked, noticing his gaze. "Did I forget the feathers in my hair?" "No," he answered, his voice soft. "It's just, you make this place better." She looked at him, her eyes sparkling, but she just nodded. "It's you, Zach," she said quietly. "I'm just helping." By evening, the campsite came to life. Tourists gathered around the fire, their voices mingling with the crackling of firewood. Zach led a group of 10 people, among whom was a man in his 40s, thin, with tired eyes. His name was David, and he came alone, without family, without friends. Zach noticed that he kept to himself, but did not bother with questions. He knew that the canyon itself drew the truth from those who were willing to speak. After dinner, David walked over to Zach, who was cleaning the grates of steaks. His hands shook, and he was silent for a long time before speaking. "Mr. Miller," he began, his voice hoarse, "can I see you for a minute?" Zach nodded, wiping his hands. "Just Zach," he said. "What's happened?" David looked at the fire, his face tense, as if he was struggling with something inside. I I don't know how to say it," he began. "A year ago, I was on the verge. Lost my job, my wife, everything. I thought that life was not worth living. And then I found your campsite. I read the reviews, saw the photo. I decided to come." Zach listened, his face calm, but something tightened inside him. He knew that tone, that pain. He heard it himself that night at the cliff. "I spent a week here," David continued, his eyes sparkling. "I walked along the paths, looked at the stars, and listened to the silence. And this place, you saved my life. I'm not kidding. I wanted to live again." Zach froze, his throat tightening. He didn't know what to answer. He was used to mending fences, leading groups, and lighting fires. But to save, he never thought he was capable of this. "I'm just doing my job," he said finally, his voice quiet. "No," David shook his head. "You do more. This place, it heals, and you too." He shook Zach's hand, his palm cold but strong, and walked away to his tent. Zach remained standing, looking into the fire. David's words echoed in his head. "Saved my life." He looked at the canyon, at its dark silhouettes, and for the first time he felt that his work was not just a way to survive. It was its value. Hope approached, her steps light. "Everything is fine?" she asked, noticing his thoughtful look. "Yes," he answered, and his voice was firmer than usual. "I just realized something." She nodded without asking. Her hand touched his elbow, and that was enough. The canyon was bright in the afternoon light, its rocks shining like fire, and the air saturated with the warmth of summer. Zach stood at the new route he had been plotting for the past months. The trail wound through a narrow passage, past old pine trees and rocks, to an observation deck overlooking the entire canyon. He called it Hope Trail. He didn't tell her, but he knew she'd know it when she saw it. It was his way of saying that she had become part of his world, his new path. It's been a year since their campfire dinner, and during that time Hope has become more than just a guest. She came almost every day, sometimes with food for the enclosure, sometimes with tools, sometimes just with coffee and a smile. Their conversations around the fire became a ritual, their silence a language that did not need words. Zach didn't call it love, he was afraid of that word after Candace, but he knew Hope was home. Not a place, but a feeling. One evening, as they sat around the fire, Zach looked at her and realized that he didn't want her to leave. Not today, not tomorrow, never. He took her hand, his fingers were rough from work, but her skin was warm. "Hope," he said, his voice hoarse. "Stay. Not overnight. For good." She looked at him, her eyes widened, but she didn't move away. Her smile was soft, but there was strength in it. "Are you serious, Zach Miller?" she asked, her voice trembling with laughter and something else. "What is this, a proposal?" "I don't know," he admitted, and his lips twitched into a smile. "But I know that I want to wake up and see you. Every day." Hope was silent, her eyes sparkling in the firelight. She squeezed his hand, her fingers strong. "Okay," she said finally, "but my dog is coming with us, and he sleeps on the bed." Zach laughed, and his laugh was loud, free. He hugged her, and her warmth was like a canyon deep, real. They decided to live together in the house that he had once built for another life. Now this was their home for two. The opening of the Hope Trail was attended by tourists, locals, and even a few reporters from the town. Zach led the group, his steps confident, and Hope walked next to him, her hand occasionally touching his. When they reached the lookout, the crowd gasped. The canyon stretched out before them, endless and majestic. Zach looked at Hope, and she smiled when she saw her name sign. "You named her after me?" she asked, her voice quiet but full of emotion. Otherwise, he answered, and his eyes were warm. You showed me that you can move on. She squeezed his hand, and they stood together, looking out over the canyon. This was their path, new, honest, theirs. Vegas greeted Candace with its usual neon chaos. Casino signs flashed like screaming ghosts, and the air was saturated with the smell of cigarettes, asphalt, and cheap perfume. She sat in her pickup truck in the parking lot of the Desert Star Motel, staring at a peeling sign that promised clean rooms and Wi-Fi. Her suitcase, battered and covered with road dust, lay in the back seat, and in her jeans pocket there were exactly $40, all that was left after Los Angeles. She was back where she had fled years ago, but now Vegas didn't feel like home. He was the grave where her dreams were buried. Candace got out of the car, her steps were heavy, as if she was dragging her entire failure with her. The motel was just as she remembered it. Dirty carpet in the lobby, the smell of bleach and sweat, the blank-eyed receptionist. She got a job on her first day as a receptionist, night shifts, $10 an hour. She was hired without question because in Vegas no one asks about the past. Everyone here was a fugitive from debt, from love, from themselves. Her motel room was cramped, with stained wallpaper and a bed that creaked with every movement. Candace sat on the edge of the mattress, looking at her phone. The screen was dark, with no notifications. Her Instagram, once full of likes and comments, was now dead. She hasn't posted anything since Troy kicked her out of his loft. Her subscribers, the few thousand she had gained thanks to his stories, disappeared like smoke. She scrolled through her feed, but every post parties, beaches, smiles was like a blow. She was no longer part of this world. Maybe she never was. Damn, Candace, she muttered, rubbing her eyes. Her fingers trembled, and she threw the phone on the bed. She wanted to cry, but the tears dried up somewhere between La and Vegas. All that was left was emptiness, cold and sticky, like the sweat on her skin. Work at the motel was monotonous, handing out keys, cleaning rooms, listening to guests' complaints. Candace put on a smile like a mask, but her eyes showed fatigue. She saw herself in the mirror behind the counter, hair that had lost its shine, skin that had become dull without makeup, wrinkles that weren't there before. She was 34, but she felt like an old woman. Vegas was sucking the life out of those who couldn't keep up the pace, and Candace knew she had lost. One night, as her shift dragged on forever, she sat at the counter, leafing through a magazine someone had left behind. Between the pages there was an advertisement glossy, with bright photos of the canyon. Echo Canyon Campground, the sign read, "Find peace in the heart of Arizona." Candace froze, her heart sank. She recognized this place, every stone, every path. The photo was of Zach standing by the fire, his face calm but strong. There was a woman nearby, tall, with dark hair. Her hand lay on Zach's shoulder. They smiled, and there was something in their smiles that Candace had never known about him. Happiness. She read the text. Zach Miller's campground is a place to find yourself. Reviews from tourists, photos of the enclosure, a new route called Hope Trail. Candace felt her throat tighten. Zach didn't just survive, he built something bigger. He moved on without her. And she was here, in this motel, where even the walls smelled of defeat. Candace closed the magazine, her fingers trembling. She got up, went out onto the motel porch, and lit a cigarette, although she promised herself to quit. The smoke rose to the sky, and her eyes filled with tears. She cried not loudly, not hysterically, but quietly, as if tears were the last thing she had left. She cried for Zach, for their lives, for the Candace who had once laughed in his truck, for the one who thought she could be a star. She cried for everything she had lost, and for everything she would never get back. "I'm sorry, Zach," she whispered, looking at the stars. But the stars were indifferent, and so was Vegas. Nobody answered. Days at the motel faded into gray. Candace worked, slept, and ate cheap microwave food. Her old friends from Vegas, Tess, Leela, others did not answer their calls. They lived their lives, casinos, parties, new faces. Candace was a thing of the past for them, like a faded ticket to a show. She tried to write another letter to Zach, but stopped at the first line. What could she say? What's sinking? What are your regrets? He didn't want her words, and she didn't blame him. One day, while cleaning her room, she found a newspaper with the same advertisement for a campsite. She sat on the unmade bed, looking at the photo of Zach, her fingers stroking his face on the paper. She remembered how he looked at her on their first night, how he promised that he would always be there. She remembered his ring on the pillow, his silence, his pain. She destroyed it, but it didn't break. And she was the ashes that Vegas swept under the rug. Candace stood up, her legs shaking. She went outside, where the neon flashed like a mockery. She wanted to leave, start over, but where? La was a lie, Vegas was a grave, and the canyon belonged to Zach, and she had no right to go back there. She took out her phone and opened Instagram, but instead of scrolling through her feed, she deleted the app. Her fingers trembled, but she felt a strange sense of relief. It was a small step, but it was hers. At night, after her shift, Candace sat in her room, looking out the window. Behind the glass, Vegas sparkled, but its light did not reach her. She took out a notepad and began to write not to Zach, but to herself. The words flowed unevenly, like her thoughts, about pain, about guilt, about how she had lost herself. She wrote until she dozed off, and her last thought was that maybe one day she would find a way to live. Not like a star, not like a him my wife, but as Candace, just Candace. But for now, she was here, in this motel, among the ashes of her life, and all she had left were tears and the memory of the canyon she had lost. The canyon was shrouded in the silence of the night, its rocks dissolved in the darkness, and the stars burned overhead, as if someone had scattered diamonds on black velvet. The campfire crackled, casting a warm glow on the faces of Zach and Hope. They sat on a log, their shoulders touching each other, and their hands intertwined not tightly, but confidently, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. The campsite was asleep. The tourists had gone to their tents, the aviary with the hawks was quiet, and even the wind whispering in the pines seemed softer than usual. This was their moment, their corner in the infinity of the canyon. Zach stared into the fire, his face calm, but his eyes reflecting a depth he rarely showed. It's been 2 years since Candace left, 2 years since he left the ring on the pillow and went to the mountains. Then he thought that his life was over, that the emptiness inside would become his eternal companion. But now, sitting next to Hope, he felt that everything was not in vain. Pain, betrayal, loneliness, all this brought him here, to this fire, to this woman, to this new beginning. Hope turned her head, her dark hair falling over her shoulder and the firelight flickering in her eyes. She squeezed his hand, her fingers warm despite the cold of the night. "What are you thinking about, Zach Miller?" she asked, her voice soft, but with a slight taunt that always made him smile. "You look like the canyon told you a secret." He chuckled, his lips twitching, and he looked at her. Her face was open, without a shadow of falsehood, and he suddenly realized how much she had changed his life. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a river that wears away a stone. She was nearby in the enclosure, on the trails, by the fire, and her presence became his anchor, his home. "I think I'm happy," he said, his voice hoarse but sincere. "I didn't think I'd feel this again." Hope raised her eyebrows, her smile widening. "Seriously?" she asked, leaning closer. "Zach Miller, Mr. Seriousness, confesses his happiness. Where is my phone number? I need to write it down." He laughed, and his laugh was deep, free, like an echo in a canyon. He pulled her towards him, and she pressed herself against his shoulder. Her warmth was like an extension of the fire. "Don't mock me," he said, but his eyes sparkled. "I'm serious. Everything that happened. Candace, the pain, all of this. If I had to go through everything again, I would choose this path. Because he brought me here, to you." Hope froze, her breathing becoming quieter. She raised her head, looking into his eyes, and there was so much in her gaze, tenderness, strength, love, that Zach felt his heart squeezing. She didn't answer right away, she just squeezed his hand tighter, and that was enough. "You know," she finally said, her voice almost a whisper, "I would also choose this path. Even with my losses, with my scars. Because he led me to you, Zach." He looked at her, and for a second time stood still. The canyon, the fire, the stars, everything became the background for this moment, for their words, for their truth. He leaned down and kissed her slowly, softly, as if he wanted to remember her every breath. She answered, her fingers sliding along his cheek, and in that kiss there was everything they didn't say: gratitude, hope, promise. When they pulled away, Hope smiled, her eyes sparkling with tears, but they were happy tears. "You're getting sentimental," she said, trying to hide the trembling in her voice. "You will soon start writing poetry." "You won't wait," he replied, but his smile was wider than ever. "But I can light another fire. For you." She laughed, throwing her head back, and her laughter was like music filling the canyon. They sat like that for a long time, holding hands, looking into the fire. Words were no longer needed, their silence spoke louder. Zach felt the last shadow of Candace, the last bit of pain dissolve in that warmth. He was at home, not at the campsite, not in the canyon, but with Hope. And this was a point of no return, not to the past, but to the future that he chose. The fire was burning down, the coals were glowing red, and Zach looked up at the sky. The stars were the same as the night he went into the mountains, when he thought he had lost everything. But now they seemed closer, brighter, as if the canyon had given him their light. He squeezed Hope's hand, and she responded, her fingers intertwined with his. They didn't speak, didn't move, just looked at the sky full of stars, and knew that this was their final chord, not the end, but the beginning. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.